So let me briefly introduce myself. My name is Meredith Miller. I'm the Vice President for Trade, Energy, and Economics at the National Bureau of Asian Research and the Director of our Washington, D.C. office. And I invite you all to get comfortable for what promises to be a terrific panel discussion. We're going to be discussing U.S. trade policy in the Asia-Pacific and the Trans-Pacific Partnership in the context of the Obama administration's rebalancing towards the region. Although most of the headlines have focused on the security aspects of the rebalancing, it's difficult to overstate the importance of our economic relationships in Asia for the future prosperity and well-being of the United States. As you all know, Asia is home to the most rapidly growing and populous economies in the world. And it is this rapid economic development that's driving the tremendous shifts we're seeing in the geopolitical landscape. In 2010, China became the world's second largest economy, and the IMF's recent economic outlook has predicted that China and India will continue to grow at 8.2% and 6.9% respectively, despite a sluggish economic recovery in the U.S., high oil prices, and the crisis in the Eurozone. Secretary Clinton wrote last year in her article in Foreign Policy, America's Pacific Century, that the economic recovery of the United States will depend on exports to Asia and the ability of the U.S. to access Asian markets. She pledged in that article to elevate economic policy as a core pillar of American foreign policy. Along with completion of the U.S.-Korea Free Trade Agreement, which has now gone into effect, the Trans-Pacific Partnership Agreement has been a key aspect of this strategy. 9 Pacific countries, Australia, Brunei, Chile, Malaysia, New Zealand, Peru, Singapore, the United States, and Vietnam are taking part in the negotiations, and several other countries have indicated an interest in joining, opening up the possibility that the TPP could become a platform for wider regional economic integration and eventually a free trade area of the Asia Pacific. So we have with us this morning a really excellent panel to share with us their expertise and insights into what role trade policy can and should play in the U.S. rebalance towards Asia. You have their full bios before you, but I'd like to briefly introduce them before we begin our discussion. Mr. David Bisbee, to my right, is the Deputy Assistant USTR for Southeast Asia, and he also serves as the Deputy Chief Negotiator for the TPP. David has deep expertise on Southeast Asia, and you can see in his bio that he doesn't shy away from a challenge because the 2 languages he's chosen to study are Vietnamese and Japanese. To my right, we also have Angela Ellard, who has spoken at Engaging Asia before, and it's a real treat to have her back again. Angela is the House Ways and Means Committee's Chief Trade Counsel and the Trade Subcommittee Staff Director in the U.S. House of Representatives. She's worked on the Hill for over 15 years, and in that time has been an integral player in every piece of trade legislation, including the U.S.-Korea FTA and the TPP going forward. So today, Angela and David will both be speaking off of the record. To the far end of the table on my left is Ed Gresser. Ed is the Director of ProgressiveEconomy. He has experience both in the executive and the legislative branch. He's worked for Senator Baucus on the Hill and for Charlene Barshevsky at USTR. It's been a great privilege for us at NBR to work with Ed over the past few years. He's written a number of excellent papers for us, including a commentary for today's discussion, which I hope you all had a chance to pick up at the registration desk and is also available on our website, which asks the question, does U.S.-Pacific policy need a trade policy? And if so, is the TPP the right one? We're looking forward to his remarks today. And then last but certainly not least in terms of experience and expertise in working on trade policy, we have Ambassador Mike Moore, New Zealand's ambassador to the United States. He has served his country at the highest levels, including as Prime Minister and in several ministerial and deputy ministerial posts. He also served as Director General of the World Trade Organization and oversaw the launch of the Doha Development Round and the accession of many countries, including China. He is very passionate about the benefits of trade and ensuring that those benefits are realized by developing as well as developed countries. As you can see, we've got a wealth of expertise up here, and I'm going to ask each of our panelists to make some brief opening remarks, and then we'll open it up for discussion with all of you and are looking forward to your input as well. So I'm going to ask Ed to start maybe with a few comments from his paper, and then we'll turn to the rest of the panel for their insights.
Hi, thank you so much. I'm really grateful to Meredith for commissioning this paper and honored to be on this panel. Ambassador Moore is one of the leading figures of trade policy for the last decade, former prime minister, really, someone who I'm thrilled to be on the panel with him. Angela, David are longtime friends, and I think it sounds a bit smarmy, like the things you always say on panels, but they are really examples of the talent and intelligence and dedication to the common good that America has in its trade negotiators and its legislative people. So I'm very pleased that they're here and to be on the panel with them. The point of departure for the paper is a comment that our Secretary of State, Hillary Clinton, made in her foreign policy article, which I thought was really unusual for an American official. It reads as follows: Asians ask whether we can make and keep credible economic and strategic commitments, and whether we can back those commitments with action. Normally, a powerful official will, in the first 6 months of an administration will say, everything is a disaster. We inherited a really lot of problems. After 9 months, everything is great. Our policies are working. There are no questions anywhere in the world. People are lining up behind us and so forth. She's quite honest in saying there are real questions about U.S. role in the Pacific. Those, in part, emerged from the financial crisis, the damage to the American economy and American public credit, those sorts of things. The only way we can answer those questions is handling our own affairs at home. But there are also real questions about the types of engagement, on the military side that Congressman Hanabusa was discussing, and on the economic side, because I think the basic American strategy for the Pacific has been not outdated, but eroded a bit by the passage of time and the changing of structures. If you look back to the early 1970s, and since then, we have alliances with the democracies of the Pacific, sort of underpinned by the U.S.-Japan Security Treaty. We have an engagement and cooperation with China whenever possible on the basis of communiques and Taiwan Relations Act. We have open market policy. We have people-to-people in education. That has been basically the way we've dealt with the Asia-Pacific for the past 40 years and most of my lifetime. Some of the premises of that policy are not gone, but a bit dated. The alliance with Japan in particular was an alliance between the world's two largest economies, with the U.S. as also the largest buyer of Asian goods. China is now the world's second largest economy. The U.S. is no longer the largest buyer of Asian goods. China is the largest buyer of Asian goods. That raises some questions about, how durable is American strategy and how much does it need to be updated? The pivot to Asia, or the rebalancing of policy, we've just, heard a lot of really sort of good discussions, the military side of things, updating the alliances, new security relationship with New Zealand, very quick and effective response to the opening in Burma or Myanmar, passage of Chorus FTA. Where do we go from here? And does this, I think, quite effective diplomatic policy need a trade analog? Our paper answers yes on 4 grounds, which I won't go into in great detail. One is enlightened self-interest. Asia is the area of the world's greatest growth. Over the next 5 years, the world economy is supposed to grow by 21.6 billion or 22 trillion, and about 9.5 trillion of that is in Asia. We are in a down period for our economy and do need to tap foreign growth for exports and revival here. There is an argument from past success. The last really 20 or 30 years have been an extraordinary period of opening and integration in the Pacific, and that has come along with, or helped to bring, massive reduction of poverty, relatively more stable politics, We are, it is not often remarked, in the longest period recorded of peace among the major Pacific powers, at least since the 17th century, and maybe longer than that. There is an argument from current diplomacy, which is that trade policy, negotiation of agreements, discussions of infrastructure is one of the major ways Asian countries deal with each other right now. There are many, many dozens of FTAs, there are many talk shops, and to be absent from those discussions and agreements and talk shops is to be absent from a kind of big swath of Pacific diplomacy. And there is an argument from reform. If you look at the American trade system, most of it is, or the American trade regime in the sense of tariffs, most of it is taxation of Asian products. That's, we have about $28 billion in tariffs, and I think $22 billion comes from Asian goods. And by far the largest source is taxation of clothes, often from very low-income Asian countries, Cambodia, Laos, Bangladesh, and so forth. This is not a system to be proud of, and it's one that we ought to be thinking about changing. So yes, Pacific strategy, I think, does need a trade policy, and for quite a lot of reasons. Is TPP the correct one? The paper's answer is it can be. There are many good things to say about it, and a couple of particularly valuable things in the design of the agreement. But there are also a couple of questions to ask. I think to be effective as a trade strategy, you need a couple or maybe 4 qualities. It ought to be big enough to affect the flows of trade and investment. It ought to be future-oriented so that issues like services and internet-based trade and standard setting get a lot of attention in a way that often they don't in current Asian agreements. It needs to be one that avoids unintended harm. That is to say, any FTA is a kind of preferential agreement that can damage non-members. We should know who they are and be secure in that if there is damage, then it's something that either they can deal with or they can manage by joining the agreement. And it needs to have a kind of complementarity with our political strategy. And I don't want to take too much time, but let me make a few comments about each of those 4 points as they relate to the TPP. The last one, complementarity to Pacific political and military strategy, I think TPP does very well. It creates a kind of definition of the Pacific that is geographic and littoral, that includes immigrant societies, it includes 2 majority Muslim states, includes Vietnam. It is at least designed to be open to new members. So it has a kind of a friendly and inclusive approach, I think, which is one that's quite consistent with the American alliance networks and the political vision we've had for the Pacific. It is also future-oriented. TPP has a lot of engagement with data flows, with electronic commerce, with a set of policy issues that are really important to the area where I think the major growth in trade will be in the next 20 or 30 years. If you look back, a lot of the trade growth of the last 50 years was in manufacturing, based on the lowering of tariffs and the invention of container shipping. I think services over the next 20 years will be the big area of growth, and this is an agreement that will work well with that. On the other hand, I think it is also an agreement that can do some unintended harm and can do some harm to countries that will have difficulty absorbing it. Take the case of Cambodia. About 10% of Cambodian GDP is based on selling clothes to the United States. That's the country's main industry. It's its main urban employer. Those are very high tariff products, and Cambodia may have a lot of challenges dealing with duty-free competition from Vietnam. So, and it's not the only case, but it's a kind of easy one to identify. Post-sanctions Burma will be probably very dependent on the same sorts of industries. Laos and Bangladesh and even Pakistan similarly. We ought to be thinking about that and finding ways to avoid a really big trade diversion and disruption of those economies. Finally, trade strategy needs to be big enough to have a major effect. At the moment, TPP has a large number of members, but and some of them are quite big economies. But the U.S. is the only really large economy in it, and if you look at the $9.5 trillion in growth, about 800 billion of that, or 10%, is set to come from TPP members. So we need to think hard, given the interest that Japan has expressed, that Canada has expressed, that Mexico has expressed, about ways to ensure that they do participate. I think this is it's a very big decision point, and I do know that our negotiators are working at an accessions process on how to bring in other countries. But I also know that of all the trade areas in the world, only the European Union has managed an accession process. And that was because from their beginning in the 1950s, they had the big continental economies already involved, Germany, France, Italy, Netherlands, and so forth, and had a kind of magnetic pull and attraction for other European countries. The same is true for the WTO. Accession process is very difficult, and if TPP is ratified in its current state without these three big outside economies, it may be very difficult. It may be that this will be, in the end, a kind of big and valuable FTA, but not one that really has the cachet of platform and template and all these words that the administration is using to describe it. So I feel that the big challenge right now is to make sure that it doesn't stop where it is, but does include these larger economies in the region. That said, I think I've more than exhausted my time. Again, I'm very grateful to be here and honored to be here with Ambassador Moore and with David and with Angela, and look forward to their comments.
Thanks, Ed, for starting us out with such a thoughtful overview and putting some challenges on the table for our panelists to address in their remarks as well. I'd like to turn to Ambassador Moore next for his perspective as a TPP partner and someone with so much experience in the development of the world trading system.
Well, thank you, Meredith, and thank you for the introduction. I always say I have a great future behind me, you know. The highlight of my time at the WTO was the accession of China into a rules-based system. I get far too much credit for this in China, but I don't care. The Director General's power is pretty limited, but that's a fundamental thing, and I'm heartbroken and disappointed that the Doha round, in terms of the substance of the negotiations, hasn't moved ahead fast enough. And in terms of the substance of the rule-making procedures inside the WTO, hasn't moved at all. And we want to see that happen. New Zealanders are multilateralists by instinct, by self-interest, and by principle. So anything I have to say now is not in contradiction to these ambitions. We want to see Doha get some gas. We know we should keep that brand, but put more gas in the tank. And we want to see China and India step up and help us kickstart this round. But having said that, New Zealand's principles on multilateralism became quite expensive. We were suffering trade diversion. There's a cost to not being in this, and now we've become quite promiscuous. We have done a deal with ASEAN, of course Australia some time ago. We are the first developed country to do a deal with China. And my report to you is our business with China is good. Things are going fine. They're growing. It's all we expected, and China has proved to be an extremely good partner. And it's important to us. One of the things I love about DC is these think tanks and these sort of meetings, and I was fascinated with previous conversations about things military and things regional. Trade is a part of security. All development and growth is. Here's TPP. Now, some may not remember, but it began with sort of Singapore and New Zealand. How hard was that? Singapore doesn't have many cows. And Singapore is a very open economy, and we admire what Singapore does. And I know in my political life I always studied what Singapore did in all sorts of areas and then copied it badly. So this has been an expanding model. Here's the deal. We now have, as you know, Vietnam, Malaysia, Brunei, Singapore, New Zealand, Peru, Chile, the United States. This group represents the US's third biggest trading partner as it is. We were concerned that the US wasn't engaged enough in our region at all sorts of levels. We were rapt and pleased when we saw the Colombian, Korean and Panama deal go through. I can report to you that TPP ambassadors in this town and officials work closely together. With advice from friends in USTR and elsewhere, it was surprising when we did our calls on the hills a year or so ago, saying it may sound strange, this Korean deal will actually hurt New Zealand a bit, there's some diversion there that's not attractive. But we need you to do the Korean deal, we need you to do the Colombia deal, we need you to do the Panama deal, so that people know you're in the fight. And that has been done. Now we'll talk to you about TPP. Here's our group. We have our war room, we're studying what's happening in town. We had some words up, what could be the best words the President could use at APEC in Hawaii. He used better words than we thought he would use. Words like elimination of tariffs, words like comprehensive. Others use very strong words like no exemptions. And people talking of a 21st century deal and the supply chain. It is real. There are huge gains to be made for all of us. We see this as an ISO 2000 standard-setting deal up there, you know. That could be a model elsewhere. And we like to see ourselves as true believers. The world economy has changed. The supply chain stuff is real. It's not a joke. It's enormous cost. Even when you're talking about the F-35, 9 countries involved. Was it, or 8? I don't know what we do. We hopefully buy the sheepskin covers for seats or something. This is the new economy, and we ignore this at our peril. Here's the other thing. It has to be an expanding model. And because it has momentum, and because it's real, and because 500 negotiators are meeting frequently and are meeting again in Dallas soon, others are looking at joining. This is a splendid thing. Of course, we'd like to see Japan, and of course Mexico, Canada, of course other countries in the region, particularly concerned for our brothers and sisters in Cambodia and soon to be Burma. Of course we want to see some integration there. However, this is our fear. Will we lose momentum and therefore not do it? Would we become a mini APEC? Now, I was at the first APEC ministerial, and our deliverable for years was always getting a new member. Well, that's big news. So what? Then where do we go? But of course we want them in. Will the speeches and papers and sign-up be the same as we're getting in the WTO? What would change the speeches? Our biggest fear, and maybe this is me because I'm so battle-scarred, you know, from this, and just because I fail doesn't mean to say the next generation is going to fail. Would we lose momentum? That's my personal biggest concern, but this is a decision our masters have yet to make and don't have to make. There are processes that have been worked through. We're meeting with dear friends in Japan and elsewhere, sensing how far they think they can go, right? But it would be a dreadful failure if TPP was just TPP in 5 years' time. That would be enormous failure. Because I've written so many good articles against regionalism and bilateral deals, and because I have enormous powers of rationalisation, I would like to think some of the models we get up on, serious stuff like SOEs, like IP, and others, could travel in negotiations, maybe even in Geneva. So let's get it up. I, of course, have to talk about agriculture a bit, otherwise you wouldn't think I was from New Zealand. But if you talk of the whole TPP, let's go through the difficult ones. Let's get to the hard areas where we're going to be real hard. For Vietnam, they need something on textiles. That's a deal breaker for them. And the catfish issues, please. Our friends in Malaysia, government procurement, financial services. I'll give you a story about Malaysia. They are serious. They had in town a minister who was a member of Parliament and a minister at the same time. We went to the ITC. New Zealand was with them because they're mates and because of all sorts of things you'll never understand. And the person in the ITC leaned over to JJ, their ambassador and minister, and said, how do we know you're serious? 10 years ago, you couldn't talk about these issues of procurement, financial services. And JJ had a brilliant answer. He said, well, 10 years ago I stopped it. I was Minister of Finance. Now we think it's right. Singapore, of course, is always so far ahead of the game. Australia, they have serious issues on sugar, investor status. We have serious issues on dairy, I'm sorry to say, but it's real for us. And I can give you some figures on dairy because there's still a lot of black PR out there. Our total production now is only world growth. And if you look at the growth in Asia, we're capturing less of it than the American dairy industry. We're actually getting into a supply problem here. The case I'm making is that I just hope we're big enough not to stumble over a catfish and a few pairs of underpants and a few 100,000 socks and a few tons of sugar, that we can see the huge project out there, and we see it as a beginning, not an end. Now, do not doubt the ambition we have. Do not doubt how our team, all our countries are working together. We are true believers. We mean it. We believe in an ambitious America. We think you can be ambitious enough to see this as a project in itself, but a project that stages forward. We do not see it as an inclusive, narrow, protectionist little group that we're all cuddled together, that we're frightened of our dear friends in the region. We think the opposite. We see it as engagement, and my report to you is that USTR and others have been very, very good on this, and we're working our guts out. And when the President says he wants to see something on the table this year, we are trying real hard. We have to make some difficult decisions too, and we're up to making them. Thank you.